Newsman and former host of Night Times on KTCA television.
Good evening. We invite you to spend the next hour with us as some of your Twin Cities neighbors say what they think about the way Channel 4 has been doing its news job lately. They'll talk with members of the WCCO staff who choose the news, gather and process it, and then put it on the air. The news department is not involved in the production of this program. They are the subject of it. We won't get all the answers because we won't even get to ask all the questions, but the news stories that we do focus on are sure to provoke some lively exchanges of opinion and insight. And I am especially happy to be part of this program because I am a news junkie, and it is great to be with people who are interested enough to talk about the news business. The stories we'll see come from a sample week we chose at random, the 10 p.m. report starting Sunday, October 13th. You will see highlights of that week in a moment. And then we'll start our conversation between some news consumers we've brought together in the studio and a group of Channel 4 reporters, editors, and producers, and the news director. Later, we'll look at videotape reports we have prepared on the anatomy of 3 major news stories. But first, here are some glimpses of that first week's worth of news.
You are watching WCCO television, Minneapolis, St. Paul. All today's news with Mike Walcher, Debbie Ely.
The story that started the week became the major theme of the week.
Good evening, everyone. A murder in the park is under investigation tonight.
In just a moment, details on the probe into the rape and murder of a 16-year-old girl in South Minneapolis.
That was the big local story. In world news, the big story was the aftermath of the hijacking of the Italian cruise ship by Arab terrorists.
Secretary of State says
when a big name hits town and can comment on a breaking story, assignment editors send cameras.
The surest way to have further violence is to make terrorist acts free.
Almost drowned this morning.
We gathered a dozen news consumers at the station to screen this sample week and to say what they thought about it.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, the first season of horse racing in Minnesota is finished.
I think it's wonderfully entertaining. It's obviously a big profit leader and it's really the avant-garde of the station. And I can see it, and I love it, and I watch it every night, and I'm totally taken by it. But anybody who sees the television as a way to get the news is totally nuts.
Now, this was an unusual experience for these people. This is not the way they, or most of us, watch TV news.
Women are making great gains in the legal profession, but it has not been easy. That's what Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor told a group of female judges today in Minneapolis. It has been said that O'Connor could succeed Warren Burger as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
And the line that bothered me the most in the whole broadcast was, it has been said that Justice O'Connor could succeed Warren Burger as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, the use of the passive there, it has been said. Who said it? And when did that person say it? My suspicion is that the only person that ever said it was the newscaster, and you saw the very source of that of that quote.
I suddenly realized how little attention I paid to the news. I mean, I turn it on to pick up what happened that day, a few facts, and to see if we're at war, and that's about it.
Except for the gang stories and the closing of Canterbury Downs, the week seemed typical. Here are excerpts of stories lifted right out of the middle of Thursday night's 10 p.m. report.
anyone on their way home this evening along 494 felt the effects of an accident between a truck and a bridge. Teachers' unions are meeting in the Twin Cities today and tomorrow. And while they are holding separate conventions...
Today, the governor's task force on airport noise met for the first time to address the problem.
Bloomington Mayor Jim Lindau, one of the mall's main supporters, says he's nearly ready with a new package. The
celebration marks 2 years since the financially ailing Pabst Olympia Brewery was taken over by Stroh's. Other than Bud Grant...
Other stories that made news that week included Max Winter's attempt to sell his share of the Vikings to Carl Pohlad, Irwin Jacobs, and the scrambler here, Fran Tarkenton. One wall of a lock in the Welland Canal collapsed and blocked traffic to the St. Lawrence Seaway. And Governor Perpich wrote to county officials asking them not to impose penalties on farmers who failed to meet their deadline for paying taxes. The content of the 10 p.m. report for the whole week totaled 3 hours and 8 minutes. Here's how the time broke down by types of stories. The biggest chunk went to sports, including the special treatment of closing day at Canterbury Downs. Next came crime news, centering on the Kreitz murder and whether a gang did it. Weather followed closely, along with news of health care and the environment. Business news and human interest stories occupied the middle ground, followed by general local stories and coverage of international terrorism. Local traffic accidents and international politics accounted for a tiny fraction of the week's offerings. We mailed questionnaires to people who were covered in the week's news and to people who we felt had a direct interest in a story. This was not a scientific random sample. We asked them if the stories were accurate, and if not, how many errors they found. And we asked if, accurate or not, the stories were fair. Of the 350 people we surveyed, 216 responded. Even though almost 94% of them found stories entirely accurate or generally accurate, almost 20% of those people considered stories unfair. What does that mean? It means they thought that WCCO News either left out or exaggerated key aspects of stories, and as a result, distorted them. What drew the most comment, aside from the gang and racetrack stories, were the longer, more complex series or features.
That romantic vision of the river we all read about in Mark Twain novels has given way to a more dreadful reality.
One look at where the murky Mississippi meets the clear blue waters of the St. Croix speaks for itself.
I can't help but to think what Mark Twain might say if he were to see the river in the shape that it is today, what he would write, what he would say.
Wouldn't believe it, would he?
I know he would weep. I'm certain of that.
These brands are in contention for the very best vanilla ice cream. Each vanilla in our surveys, say experts, is in the top 25% of all ice creams in the area. Their prices, however, vary considerably. But price is not necessarily an indication of quality. Taste test results from a panel of university-trained ice cream judges.
One of the things the ice cream story taught me was that the news media does know how to do research. I just wish that they could use that same process and do the newsworthy stories and not waste their talent for doing research on frivolous stories.
Okay, let's begin. Anything in that report about the content breakdown or the fairness and accuracy strike you particularly? Ted Glasser.
I'd like to return to the content analysis, which I thought was very interesting, and draw your attention to a very, very informal and not a very thorough content analysis I did for the Saturday, October 19th, 10 p.m. report, which ran for about 36 minutes. And pardon me for looking down, I'm referring to my notes. When you take away the 8 minutes allocated to commercials, the nearly 11 minutes allocated to weather and sports, the 2 minutes allocated to lead-in and teases, and the 2 or 3 minutes that went to network feeds and what appeared to be wire copy, although I can't be certain, you have WCCO's tremendous resources generating between 10 and 12 minutes of news. And of that news, much of it was of the soft feature variety. The question then is, what kinds of questions are going through your minds when you have to, on a daily basis, allocate resources?
Dave Nimmer.
Well, one of the things is that, I happen to feel you're right, but this place almost went into the great porcelain toilet trying to produce a 50-minute newscast called The Scene Tonight. And one of the things that I'd like to see is to have an hour's worth of news between the hours of 6 and 7 at night. The first half hour of a quick hitting look at the community with crisp, clean stories. And the second half may be patterned after nightlines to take a look at what we ignore in this community. Talking heads. We have people speak in 20-second sound bites because that's the nature of our business. I'd like to see us have an hour's worth of local news so that we could sit down and have a discussion with somebody. But the question is, Ted, who'd watch? You know, we keep being told that we're supposed to set the agenda for the community, force them to look. This place did for 2 years, and it tried to force people to look at an hour's worth of local news, and the people said, no, we want to watch Johnny Carson.
As you know, you have people like Ted Koppel succeeding very well here in the Twin Cities and nationwide. You have the McNeil-Lair report, and you have, we all know, people at CCO, yourself, Don Shelby, who could handle different kinds of formats. could do a Ted Koppel kind of format or a McNeil Lehrer kind of format and give the Twin Cities a true alternative when it comes to television news.
I've been talking to Don Shelby lately, and Don has been writing and been quoted lately as talking about the television news business and the public being at a crossroads. Would you describe that, Don?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is a quote in the Columbia Journalism Review recently where the subject was brought about, the future of this business, and it occurs to me that both the community, the viewer, and the television industry nationwide is at, as I said, a crossroads as it tries to figure out what its role is going to be in the future. The question of, is it going to be an entertaining thing that attracts viewers, or is it going to be more firmly based in the traditional values of journalism and the public's right and need to know? So it comes down to the question of, do we give what the public needs in a traditional sense, or what it wants in a marketing sense?
Okay, that's what we're going to get into. We've been talking generally now. We're going to get specific. We're going to go to the big stories from our sample week, and here is an examination of that week from the crime.
A murder in the park is under investigation tonight.
In just a moment, details on the probe into the rape and murder of a 16-year-old girl in South Minneapolis.
First, they labeled it a rape and a murder. She was not raped. And the police, unless I am much mistaken, would never have labeled it a rape. We don't label rapes until we conclude that and there was no rape. And it was labeled a rape and a murder. That's egregious and gratuitous. And I'm sure what the police said is that they found her in a disheveled state with her pants pulled down, and it might, well, was she sexually assaulted? She might have been. It's consistent with the possibility that she was, and on television it becomes rape and murder. Bad news.
Police have no suspects, but residents believe it was someone from a local gang who killed Christine Kreitz.
The hysteria with the gangs we're going to see over and over again, and there is no doubt that, although I am a big fan of CCO News, that what they did with the gang issue, starting with this and continuing throughout, is fanning the flames.
The murder of Christine Kreitz has taken the neighborhood by surprise, especially with Halloween just 18 days away and trick-or-treating on the minds of many children.
They tied it to Halloween, they tied it to kids being on the street. To me, it was a news story that just generated fear in a lot of people. And I even wonder about showing the body. I mean, is that a necessary part of the news story? And I think about the kind of impact this must have on youngsters watching.
They were, to my mind, playing with our emotions. I resented the story.
Oh, I think it was fairly careful. We were during the week, fairly circumspect in what we did. We, right away, I know that Doug and some others sat down and tried to come up with some guidelines for how we were going to cover it, because they knew that it had the potential to be inflammatory. And I think we were pretty careful about what we did, although we certainly covered it well because it was a big story and a lot of interest in it.
Back at King Park, even junior high school students are not surprised at the murder. The gang's existence and the gang's violence aren't news to these young people.
The focus of this thing now has changed. Yesterday, everybody was surprised in the neighborhood. This was a shock. Everybody was all upset by it. Now, nobody is surprised, and it's your fault. Because you should have known this by now.
I know it's my fault. You don't have to point it out.
A police department expert on gangs says the Vice Lords, the Disciples, and the Blood operate between here, King Park on the south, and 56th and Bryant on the north. That's 96 city blocks worth of turf to fight over.
It wasn't merely rubbish, it was disingenuous. Disingenuous because he said a police expert has identified 3 gangs, 96 turf. That police expert is Robert Skamra, who issued a report in writing that I made available to the press that basically says we have around 25 to 60, maybe, gang members in the whole of Minneapolis. The whole thing is speculative, made up. But it's exciting, it's jazzy, it's sexy, it grabs our attention. It plays to our fears, it gets us all excited. Another myth has been created. Blacks are rioting, breaking glass. Elect me mayor, I'll save you. I know all about it, I'm a police officer. That's how Stenby gets elected.
What are the realistic expectations for television news broadcasting? You're rushed into a situation, you're not terribly familiar with the situation, and you have to get something in print or you have to get something on the air, and an awful lot of the factual inaccuracy is not, I believe, a matter of pernicious behavior on the part of the reporter, but rather just the lack of time to get at something.
But aren't you perpetuating stereotypes? By default, that's what happens, whether it's intentional or not.
But that kind of mindset is a part of the insidious nature of it, and maybe it's not malicious in the sense that they get up in the morning and say, how many minorities can I make look bad when I get down to the station? But when at the station, when they don't either affirmatively do something to give a more objective presentation, or when, and because they're rushed by time or whatever, they fall back to the description that John suggests, which is, well, I don't know a whole lot about this because I haven't had time to prepare, but he's black, so he must be big and bad.
Since the Chicago gangs began migrating here 5 years ago, police have learned little of how and why they exist. But the full-scale investigation into the murder of Christine Kreitz promises to raise the veil for the first time on this secret world of the streets.
WCCO is not stupid. They're doing what sells.
Sure.
They're doing what those commercials, the dollars that they bring. I mean, they've got it figured out because that's what we want.
On closer analysis, I step back and say I don't think that Chicago connection, even if established, is very important to the recognition of a gang problem, a youth problem in the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So we may have been able to direct ourselves had we had foresight in a better area that might have a more far-reaching impact in terms of public information.
But who wants to talk about illiteracy? Every time Mayor Fraser comes out with the State of the City message about youth problems, unemployment, dropout, teenage sexual education, you know, the whole council passes out with boredom. They go into it. They want to hear about monsters. They want to hear about gangs, about myths, hot stuff, jazzy, sexy. So really, that's what we want. We want to believe in demons. We want to believe in Satans, and then we want to say, all right, Mr. Police Chief, get your flamethrower and go out and incinerate them, because that's the problem.
Let's come back to Mary Vanderford, who lives in the neighborhood where Christine Kreitz was killed, right? What do you want to know from the news department about all of this?
I'd like to ask if they consider very carefully the impact of that, generating that kind of fear, of constant reporting night after night. As I looked over the reports, there wasn't anything terribly new for some of those nights, but the issue was uppermost in the news most of the nights that week.
Reed?
You bet we think about the neighborhood, and in a case like that, going back and looking at the scripts, I thought we did a fairly good job of trying not to fan the flames, as Chief Boza suggested that we did. I mean, the fact of the matter is, you had a high school girl murdered, and that doesn't happen very often. And the fact of the matter is, it was linked to gang activity. Nim can tell you a story. We about a month to 6 weeks prior to this murder, decided maybe we should look at gang activity and see if there was something out there to do a series on or a story on or just get some background information, and we basically...
It was interesting looking at Tony Boza, because the same remarks that he used in that particular tape sequence he used to us. It was broadcast on our air, saying the problems in this community are related to illiteracy, lack of jobs. I covered that story. We wrote about that story. And there's Tony Boza saying there are no gangs, but we just arrested 4 members who might be members of those gangs. What he said when they arrested them was that they were gang members. They arrested 4 gang members. And Tony Boza said there aren't well-organized gangs in the community, but yet his police officers went out into that same community and took 4 people off the street who they said were members of gangs.
Before you respond anymore, let's hear some concrete examples of what bothered people.
Well, I have some real problems, David, on that comment, because one of the announcers previously said, gee, you got 94 square blocks to fight over. I mean, as if South Minneapolis is somewhere along Bastogne and you are defending yourself very vigorously. I'm particularly disturbed, though, because of what I consider to be complete lack of source validation. I mean, I can't tell whether you got that information standing on a street corner talking to a truck driver going by, or talking to somebody who has gathered some valid information, who has done some research on gangs, with rare exception. It's an unnamed, occasionally unnamed police authority. It's just the reporter gives it right off the top. And of all of the characteristics of television that I find disturbing, particularly in sensitive areas, that's the one. Because I have no idea what the background, the resource is that goes into that.
Lee Canning, who's talking, was Nimmer's and my boss. He was city editor of the Minneapolis Star when we were young reporters, and I can remember vividly, afternoon after afternoon, he would shout across the newsroom at one of us and say, "Nimmer, do we know this?" He was the gatekeeper, and he had to satisfy himself that we had some kind of source. Now, what's your response to that, Stoney?
Well, let me just say, we went over those stories very carefully. I personally stayed late almost every night that week, or many nights that week. Mark Hooper, the 10 o'clock producer, stayed late. We talked with Nimmer, we talked with Shelby. The reason particular sources aren't identified is because people didn't want to come out and say things. But Mark Watts, one of our younger reporters with good connections on the street, spent a lot of time on his own out in the community talking to people. He gleaned a lot of information that the police had not gleaned. He talked to workers at the juvenile detention center who supplied him with information. He talked to policemen, other of our reporters. We had at one time 7 different people, photographers, reporters, and field producers working on this story. I think, by and large, it was a well-sourced, well-done, short-term examination of the gang thing. We made some mistakes. We overstated some things. The overall impact perhaps scared some people, but I'll go back to what Reed said. The fact of the matter is a 16-year-old girl was killed, executed in a park in Minneapolis, and that just doesn't happen very often.
Mary Ziegenhagen.
What are your guidelines in dealing with kids? During that week, you interviewed some young people about gangs in Minneapolis. They were on camera. A lot of the information seemed to come through the neighborhood. How do you deal with, were the ones on camera over 18, or are they young, and do you treat them in any special way?
Well, there was one young man, I believe, interviewed in King Park, who I believe was a juvenile, who agreed to be interviewed. And
You talked to the parents?
I don't think we talked to the parents.
But you as adults who are in charge of this programming and who gets on television ought to realize that the opinion of a young man might get him into trouble that he might not know that would get him into trouble. And it seems that you are the adults who are making those decisions about what we're going to see.
We had several stories that week where we were in the process of putting them together, and we got a call from a parent who said, "Hey, you interviewed my child at school today. She was in favor of it at that time, but now has second thoughts about it. I certainly have second thoughts about it." And we had to kill that part of the story.
But you should have, to me, you should have killed it all when it comes to juveniles who might not clearly know what the ramifications are going to be with that kind of interview and the information that he gave out.
Okay, but before we'll try and get a couple more questions in this section, but so we don't miss this one. A lot of people in our survey wanted to know, how did the allegation that Christine Kreitz was raped, which in fact she was not, get on the air so that the lead-in stated it flatly?
I can answer. There was suspicion the first day that she was sexually assaulted. Her pants had been pulled down, as it turned out later, intentionally by the alleged suspects. We reported that. It was reported that way all along. One night, one of the writers mistakenly said she was raped. We said it once, it was a mistake, it was an error, we shouldn't have done it, and we explained that the next day, and that's how that happened.
You want to follow this up, Claire?
Yeah, I think everyone's being a little hard on CCO for this story. I think it generally was a very well done story, except for with the exceptions that we've maybe aired. But I think being a reporter myself, people often expect the impossible from news people too. That you can't always protect every source that talks to you, and you can't really. You could kill practically every news story if you went and checked with every parent of every kid you ever talked to. But the thing that bothered me, I think, about the report was that I would like to have known more about certain aspects, and it could have done without some of the more flamboyant things that were highlighted.
Okay.
For instance, when they...
I know that you wanted to know, for example, why a 37-year-old woman, one of the indicted people, was hanging around with a teenage gang.
Well, I wondered why she was a gang member when one of the segments of the report said most of these kids were teenagers and the oldest ones were in their late 20s. I talked to a guy from the Street Academy one day whom I saw on the street, and he said, oh yeah, they're the second-generation gang members and they initiate the young ones, and this is, I think, a fascinating sociological phenomenon that I would have liked to have seen.
Okay, we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we will move on to another major story, one that generated an enormous response from people watching at home. We'll see how it strikes you. Welcome back to our spontaneous and unrehearsed meeting between some consumers of television news and some of the WCCO people who choose the news, package it, and put it on the air. We're asking viewers what they think about WCCO News, and our guests are getting a chance to comment and to question news reporters, producers, and managers. Our next case study from the sample week of 10 p.m. reports starting October 13th is highly unusual. Watch and see. It is Tuesday, October 15th. The news department knows it is closing day at Canterbury Downs. It does not know reporter Mark Watts will interview a gang member police are still looking for in connection with the Kreitz murder. Here's how the news began.
This is the 10 p.m. report.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, the first season of horse racing in Minnesota is finished.
Who were the people that came to the track? Mark Rosen will take a look at the last day. How does Canterbury attendance compare to other sporting events? A For Your Money report on the handicappers. And we will tell you where the horses go when racing season is over here. Also tonight, Dave Nimmer reports on the impact gambling has had on Minnesota. But we begin with the people who came to the track.
Matter of fact, the first time I came out here, it was a little bit disgusting.
How do you mean?
Well, you'd stand in line and you'd have a whole family in line. And I mean, you know, you just never think you're going to get up there and get your bet on.
But also in that crowd are so-called handicappers who bet smart and make a living at the track. Danny Tita of the St. Paul Pioneer Press and Dispatch puts his own money on no more than 15 horses a year.
I've had 3 or 4 pick sixes in the top 3 selections that were $30,000. So if you wanted to spend the money, you could make money.
On a typical night, the 10 p.m. report generates about 10 phone calls. On October 15th, 53 people called to complain about the amount of time devoted to Canterbury Downs, 9.5 minutes, and about how the story was played.
Attendance this year averaged more than 13,000 a day, more than 1 million for the season. And here's how that sizes up with some of the other sports. The Vikings.
This is, to my mind, the worst thing that we've seen here today. I think that the media have become, and I realize how radical the statement sounds, have become, in effect, shills for those persons who want Canterbury to succeed. They want to get all of us into the gambling thing. Those of us who are out here who haven't gambled are now told, my gosh, look at, we're told how to win. We were given a system. We're shown how people can actually make a living doing this. It's not just an okay thing, but we have a civic duty to go out and to help make it succeed. And that's why we're going to spend all this time on our news program to show you just how important this is. Well, this is really important to our economy. If we take this big a piece out of our news, we're telling you that this is a major thing. We even put this on ahead of the Christine Kreitz murder, which you know is important to us.
The Christine Kreitz story came in pretty late that night. Partially, that was a function of how difficult it is to rearrange a show. We found out about what a potentially strong story we had on that probably around 7 o'clock in the evening. But we had the ball rolling on this whole other thing, and it was very difficult to either put that in the middle.
How about leaving the show with the Christine Kreitz story and then going to Canterbury Downs?
That would have been another difficulty in that we would have, that's kind of a little bit of a function of TV, frankly. It's like you only have so much room on a front page, you only have so much room on a piece of paper, well, you only have so much room in a first section. If you want to dedicate a first section to a certain subject, which we had intended to do that night.
But I raised hell. I raised hell when I found out that we were leading with Canterbury Downs and not Mark's story.
The Christine Kreitz development, as it turned out to be, was not a development that anybody still probably recalls. In fact, it was more of an interview than it was and our story didn't depict it as being that important anyway.
No one had made clear to the producer the substance of Mark's report. So he did not realize that police were seeking this individual for questioning, that we were the first people to actually have a known gang member of the Disciples, that this individual was a former boyfriend of the dead woman. No one knew that. And the argument was that the program had been, it was a very difficult program to produce with all the special effects for Canterbury Downs, and they already had it into the mix, and they couldn't change it at that late date. And I was sickened.
television's fighting technology. We pay a lot of money to keep all these other tools. Something's got to go when you pay all that money to keep all these gizmos in there, which are important in a sense, and a lot of times it's people. I think we need to decide if producers are newspaper editors per se. Are they the people that worry about the content and the words? Are they the people that worry about the graphics and the live shots and the satellite reports? Where are we going to draw the line? I think that's where I look to decide how we could do a better job. Often I say, boy, I wish I would have had more time to rewrite that story or to look over that script a little bit better. And there are some nights I go, I wish I would have had more time to look at the graphics. But I think all those graphics and all those television things fall into one category, and you have the editorial content in the other. And to decide which direction to go, I think would help us quite a bit.
Doug Stone, I know you had a post-mortem after all of this. What conclusion did you reach about your own coverage?
Well, we had a couple conclusions. One is I think perhaps we were a couple minutes too long on Canterbury Downs. We could have done without one of the stories. However, and I also think that the gang story was interesting. I also talked to John about possibly leading with it. In retrospect, I'm not unhappy that we didn't lead with it. I think it was a kind of a mumbo-jumbo interview with a young man who was involved in the gangs but didn't add that much to the story. And I think that when you've got thousands of people spending millions of dollars, it's an important story in this community, and we are not shilling for the gamblers. We are not shilling for the racetrack. We didn't push to have Canterbury Downs built. We're simply reporting on what happened after it was built.
Yeah, I think this is part of a larger agenda, and who makes the decisions on what is carried on the news? Don mentioned the problem of local news stations being more preoccupied with image than with substance, and I think the big question here is the priorities of the news. Can we get down to the basic business of reporting the news like as occurs nationally? There seems to be a tendency to sensationalize, a tendency to sexualize, as Tony Boza mentioned. And, you know, I'd like to know how Don feels, for instance, about being on the buses throughout town with Together Tonight. Seems like a blatantly sexual approach to advertising the news, and doesn't seem to have anything to do with the news. And I don't know if we're talking to the right people. Here are basically decent, intelligent people who are trying to do their job, and it doesn't seem like they're allowed to many times.
Yeah, but that week's news wasn't all Canterbury Downs. There's a story about a seminary and a college that got together. There's a story about the Minneapolis Police Federation that was politicking in the 13th Ward and in the 3rd Ward as they came back after 20 years to do it again. There's a story about the state treasurer who's trying to regain his budget. There were all sorts of stories that some of our young reporters picked up that I'd call good news stories. I'd have called them good news stories when I was working for Canning's newspaper in 1963. And somehow they don't get remembered. I guess I get a little defensive. I thought our Canterbury coverage went out the window. It was way too much. And I was the biggest offender. I did one where I had 25 seconds of Robert Preston singing from The Music Man. That was a mistake. It wasn't good. It was bad. Was I trying to hype the story? No. Hell, I talked to Gamblers Anonymous about whether that was a problem. I talked to the FBI, the BCA, the Scott County Sheriff's Department, about a dozen law enforcement agencies to say, were there any problems? At least I found out that the mafia wasn't coming into town. Did I go out of my ear? Yeah. Was I trying to hype the track? No. Did we do too much? Sure. I believe we did. I think we got caught with our packaging pants down.
Kathy Guerin.
You know, I'm almost embarrassed to say I thought it was too long, but I kind of liked the Canterbury Downs coverage. And I tried to analyze, well, why wasn't I outraged like all these people are about it? Well, I think 2 reasons. One, the gang feature that night was horrible. It was like, let's put exhibit of a gang member, and nothing tough or analytical was asked of that young man. And 2 is that I think my expectations of the news are so low that I was satisfied by being entertained along the lines of PM Magazine. And it was a clever feature. But I do also, I'll give you some defense, is that sociologically that racetrack has made an impact. I mean, it has been something talked about, and I think a lot of people never thought it would be successful. And you should have had some reporting on it, just not that long.
You know, I think one of the most difficult things to do, and you can probably appreciate this, in trying to decide what stories you're going to cover, and just to kind of give you an idea of how we do that, We don't, I as a reporter am not handed a story every day and say, go do this story. I happen to cover a beat, which is the environmental beat, and I come up with a lot of those stories, developments that occur within that beat. People that I've talked to within the area call me and tell me about certain things. So that's how a lot of us come up with the stories. But it's very difficult to decide what you as a news consumer want to hear, because for the same reason, some of you are attorneys, ministers, what have you, everybody has different interests. And how do you put 20 minutes of news together that's going to tell the majority of people what they want to know? And I think that's what we all wrestle with. I don't know that we have the answer to that. I think we pick from what we see happening and we try and pick the best, but we are not going to satisfy everybody.
I'd like to make a point, Paul, in answer to your question, or your statement rather. You didn't know whether you were talking to the right people. Well, you're talking to half of the right people. There are no hidden manipulators here. This is it. These are the people. We are the people who make the decisions. The other half of the people, figuratively speaking, who make the decisions happen to be the public. And what you have to come to understand is that this is a corporation designed to make money. And God bless it for that. We have jobs as a result of it, and you have news as a result of it. We provide a product based on a demand of the public. And it is laissez-faire at its best. If the public does not demand more, we are not going to give more. Nor will Dayton Hudson, nor will Kmart, nor will anyone. You don't go out and build a product on speculation that you hope the public will buy, because we tried it from time to time. Documentaries we tried, nobody watched. Longer newscasts, nobody watched. Dull, important stories, nobody watched, but they were important. Somebody has to make a decision here.
So the public gets what they deserve.
The public gets what it demands. Now, if we can create somewhere along the line a demand for a greater product, I guarantee, as long as they'll pay a buck for it, we'll give it to you.
I think you're your best with the in-depth stories that
we'll give everybody a chance.
Kent, that's too facile. To say that we demanded Canterbury Downs is false. The media gave more time to Canterbury Downs than it gave to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, probably.
The Minneapolis Star gave it 5 full pages.
Now, if you're going to talk about sociological impact, or if you're going to talk about economic impact, and you say, well, sports is real news because of that, and this begs the question of whether news and information are the same thing, where are the stories about the impact now of Lou Holtz doing a dog and pony show for the legislature and getting us into the Dome, locked in 20 years in the Dome with the Gophers? Where are the stories? Where were the stories about the impact of the Dome going into downtown and exactly what that was going to do?
Okay, so you want more analysis. Okay.
Well, I
we're
think
we're going to get in our last section of discussion. We're going to get into some of the things that you all want. The last story we're going to talk about now led the news on the last night of the week. On weekends, the news staff is a skeleton crew, so if a challenging story breaks, the newsroom is often hard-pressed to cover it. As we prepared this report, we came to call it Saturday Night Live.
Good evening, everyone. It started with a series of 3 underground explosions in North Minneapolis. Power went out, and what followed was a crime wave.
It was shortly after 8 o'clock tonight that residents living near 8th and Emerson North reported hearing explosions in the sewer system. Then power went out to a large area of the north side for about half an hour. And during that time, we received reports of looting at some stores, and there was at least 1 shooting. Our live coverage begins now with Colleen Needle. She's at 19th and Newton Avenue North. And Colleen, let's start with what do we know has occurred there?
Some young women were walking down this street at the intersection of 21st Avenue and North Newton and saw a young black man in his late 20s lying in the street. He had been shot in the head. Those women called the police, and when they arrived, the man was semi-conscious. He told police he had been shot and was able to say a few words or spell out some initials. We do not know his condition. However, he was in pretty bad shape when he was here, and one policeman says he expects this to be a homicide. But as I say, we do not know the identity nor the condition of that young man. This all took place just moments after that power outage you mentioned ended. And with that part of the story, Terry Sater picks it up from here. Terry?
We headed up further north on Plymouth Avenue and ended up at a McDonald's. We found it locked, and we found out that the security guards inside had foiled an attempted robbery when the power outage occurred, and we did an interview with those folks.
We're driving up, and we saw this man bleeding, lying down in the street.
What you actually saw was an interview we did here earlier on the shooting scene. As you know, we've been feeding this tape back very fast. One of the employees at the McDonald's told us that she had earlier in the evening heard two young men, one identified himself as a disciple, a member of the Disciple gang, another was the Vice Lord gang, say that they were going to go out and hit something this evening. They didn't care what it was, they were broke, and they wanted some money. The girl at the McDonald's seemed to feel that there might have been some link. She said these guys told her that they were going to hit something tonight. Then the explosions occurred sometime after that, and all of
Now we're treated to speculations of a McDonald's employee who presumably is a 16-year-old kid that somebody went underground and caused explosions to, come back and get their cash registers without any substantive indication that she either knew or could have known what happened at 8th and Newton. A total exaggeration of what took place with regard to that power outage.
The delicious irony that has to be reported is there was no shooting.
Right.
There was no shooting. Some poor guy had been hit on the head with a bottle by his friend, knocked unconscious. And the rest is history. He was out of the hospital before the reporter made it back.
You know, it would be funny if it weren't so revealing in the way it jumbles together the kinds of, social prejudices that are so rampant today in the first place, and that one of the leading news stations in Minneapolis can not have any kind of fail-safe mechanism that prevents the airing of this kind of garbage, for people to view and make social judgments on, is probably really depressing.
The story is clearly out of control. Anyone would make that judgment. The question is, why is it out of control? It's out of control because of the use of the remote. The technology of the capability of getting out there and reporting on the scene.
I would have no way of knowing the situation in North Minneapolis except for what I heard today. Right. So my assumption, Marcia conveyed to me a different image. And so before that, I was somewhat satisfied that what they told me was fairly accurate and fairly fair.
To be very honest with you, that was probably one of the lowest, most frustrating times I have ever had as a reporter. A lot of things went wrong in our communications here, and I think it resulted, and I'm very serious, in us doing the viewers a great disservice.
We gave a fair amount of time to a story that probably didn't merit that much time in retrospect, but at the time it was happening, and the police department was going crazy. We were hearing the police radios, and we didn't have time to do anything except send people up there and tell them to gather what they could get and get in front of the camera for 10. It sounded like the end of the world from here.
The police contribute to this. It's very easy to flock the press. I know that the police contributed to the misimpression being given by that news account. And I know that they were furthering the story about, acting up. The animals are really jumping, it's really moving, it's boiling over, shooting, and it all feeds on itself. So I can almost accept the idea that the press might have been innocent dupes, but except that I don't believe in innocence.
At that point in time, there seemed to be a very, very strong link between the power outage and the robbery. The timing was too good, if you know what I'm saying. And she had made one comment to me. I said, did they say anything about knocking out power or whatever? And she goes, yeah, I think they might have, that sort of thing.
My opinion as an editor is that that kind of unverified information reported without the benefit of checking it with anyone else leads to rumor and speculation that's probably unwarranted. I mean, we fed into this gang mentality that existed during that time, and we tried to connect things that may or may not have been connected at all, and I think we've been better off without the information.
Who wants to begin?
I do. I guess I feel very, very strongly about the story. And I guess, first of all, it typifies the coming together of so many biases. First of all, I cannot believe that the news staff would not have been more critical in assessment of whether or not a power outage. I mean, there was a mindset that said it was in North Minneapolis, there was an explosion, so somebody said it so they could have an opportunity to rob and pilfer and create crime or commit crime. I cannot believe that at 5 different points in that story. There would not have been a more critical analysis of what was going on had the community been Edina or Southwest Minneapolis. They would not have believed, and they certainly wouldn't have concluded that it was the gang activity, that from 12th and Plymouth and Penn, which is a mile away from 8th and Newton where the explosion was, that the clerk in the McDonald's knew what was in fact going on. They talked about the stores being looted. One of the only stores on Plymouth Avenue is mine, and my customers helped secure my facility before they left, and I'm appreciative. But nobody thought that was newsworthy. And I guess I feel real strongly that this typifies what I was characterizing as the North Side crime, racist bias of the news reporting in the Twin Cities.
Lee Canning?
Well, I'm not too sure I'll agree with the racist comments because I don't know this. I think that's an assumption on your part. But I think this is the worst case of journalism reporting I've ever seen. I mean, hands down, anywhere, locally or nationally. You sent a reporter that couldn't have been on your staff, what? What's this last guy's name, Sater or Safer, whatever
6
it is? 6 months. He wouldn't know the North Side from Lake Michigan. He asked a completely uninformed source, and he prompted her. I mean, he led her down the road. And here's some 16-year-old at McDonald's says, it's just like saying, you'll want French fries with your meal, won't you? You bet. Okay, well, now we'll do it that way. No indication of any connection with the power company. Hey, we got an outage. I mean, NSP has outages how many times a week? I mean, they had one just this week. I mean, 20,000 homes down or something like that. All right, now, to just draw it, it just was bad reporting. Now, I can understand the difficulties on a night when you don't have your first team here, but my suggestion is, and maybe one of your first team ought to be here over the weekend. If you got that kind of judgment exercised over a weekend in a situation in which 2 events, highly unrelated, there wasn't even a shooting.
Reed Johnson.
Who up there knew a cop?
There are a lot of problems with what we did that night, and I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about the process, what's going on at that moment. I started out at WCCO as a dispatcher in early 70s, listening to police radios, and my next job was as a producer. What was happening that night, we went back and checked the police logs, was that the police radios were going crazy. There were all kinds of police reports, police saying there was a shooting, police saying that we were having problems. So the producer, at an hour before news time, has to figure out, how am I going to cover this story? And you're right, the technology worked against us that night. We know that we can get a live camera up there. We wouldn't have done that 10 years ago. We'd had to process the film and let ourselves get the facts better that night. So we sent one of our newer reporters, who happened to grow up in the Twin Cities, so he does know about the area, out there and along with Colleen, to get an eyewitness account of what's going on at this minute. We made a number of mistakes. Our producer wrote that there was a minor crime wave. The word minor got dropped, so we got a crime wave. We prompted our anchors about the questions that we wanted them not to ask, so that we wouldn't be getting into conjecture, and yet the questions got asked. And the important thing, I think, to remember or to take note of is how we handled it after the fact. We went back and talked to all of the individuals involved, and not only in a collective situation, but in a closed-door session, and said, how did you handle this poorly? I'm not convinced that it was short staffing that did it. I think maybe a large group of people could have made the same errors with so many things happening so fast.
Reed, did you report it that way? The next day, did you tell the viewers, hey gang, we blew it, I'm sorry, this was all out of proportion?
Not as clearly as we should have. The next day we said that the person wasn't shot, that he was in fact hit in the head with a bottle. If I have a regret, it is the next day we didn't go out and do another track saying we simply got misled this night. Not only simply misled, but a number of people in the police department got misled. There, in fact, something happened, but it wasn't what we described to you the night before.
Can I put something in? I want to put this thing in context for me very quickly. One, it is important for you to know that we agree that, and Colleen stated it for us, this was bad reporting. And it was the worst thing in 22 years I have seen. Know that you are looking at the lowest moment in the history of broadcasting, okay? This is not a daily piece of journalism for CCO, all right? Second, everyone who examined, from my point of view, and I'm not an apologist, I'm a critic of the media, of especially our work. The gang reporting was as good or better than any kind of reporting that you will see done on that kind of subject, and we took great care not to make this a racial issue. We took great care to try to go back and say, these people in the community knew that this was a problem a long time ago, they knew it, and the cops were not listening, and now we're paying for it. And rather than being racist, we were being respectful in that case, saying it's about time that the attention be paid to this thing.
Colleen?
So know that what we're looking at, we're not looking at a general week of WCCO-TV. We're looking at the lowest moment in broadcasting, as Lee Canning has said. This is not the way we operate.
In response to the shooting that wasn't a shooting, the way we get our information, I can't diagnose someone who's lying on the street and know what his problem is. We rely on the police for that information. In checking back with the police, they told us at the scene that it was a shooting, that he had told police it was a shooting. They cordoned off an area, wouldn't let us walk because they were looking for the bullets. They were interviewing witnesses who had heard the shots, and that's where it stood. In fact, in looking at a police report we looked at later, the policeman went looking for him in the hospital and couldn't find him. Now, other than myself trying to diagnose this fellow, there is no other way I could have gotten any other information other than what the police told me. They were my source.
But one of the assumptions that one of the people in your organization made was about the timing. And I personally, as a consumer, would rather you take more time. I would rather not have that dumped in front of my face, in my eyes. I would rather you take more time and do it as a special broadcast, a bulletin, later when you've had the time to check it out. Then I feel like I'm being respected as a consumer.
That's a very good point, because my response when I was at home enjoying a nice meal with my husband when I was called up there, sent to all these addresses, there was nothing happening. It was a normal Saturday night. People were inside watching TV. I could see the flicker of lights, and when I called and said, I happened up by that street where that young man was lying in the street. That's the only way I knew about that.
Okay, Colleen.
And I said, I don't know anything about the rest of this, and I can't talk about it. And that is a...
We're near the end of our discussion time. I want to give Reed a chance to answer this question. A number of the people who work for you, I asked them, what's your wish list so that WCCO-TV News can do a better job than it does? Every one of them said they want some kind of super copy editor person to be the gatekeeper because everybody's under the gun with all of this technology, et cetera, et cetera. Are you going to do anything about that?
I'm not sure that I agree that that's our greatest need. I think that the coming out of the week and of examining the problems that we've had, and we've started on it, we really need a concrete, solid document that has what our standards are. What do we think? How do we handle juvenile cases? How do we handle a situation like a live interview where you don't know very much about it? And we've met and decided that Don is going to help put that together for us. I think that's our greatest need. And the one point that I wanted to make, and it's about motive, and it's the most interesting thing to me when I hear your concerns about the job that we do. Our motive in putting the gang story and playing it at the top of our newscast and spending as much time on it had nothing to do with how are we going to generate ratings this week. We don't sit and make decisions on a story like that by how can we sensationalize it, how can we make more money off it. It never crossed our minds. What we did do that week in terms of discretionary material to try to promote and get viewers interested in our newscast, we did a Colleen series on the Mississippi River. I mean, hardly a sexy or sensational story, but we felt that was an appropriate piece of journalism to do that week. Are we concerned about ratings? Sure. Does it filter down on a day-by-day basis to Caroline in St. Paul, or to the producer of a newscast, or to the assignment editor? No, it doesn't. We basically make our decisions as what's the news of the day. We meet 3 or 4 times a day. What should we lead with? How should we cover it? Are we being prejudiced? Are we stepping on somebody's rights? Should we be more thoughtful?
Reed, I know that you want to solicit not only the opinions and comments of these folks, but people at home, because you want to find out what people want. If you at home can call, or rather write to 90 South 11th Street to WCCO Television with your comments about the issues that have been raised in this program, the news department and the station would appreciate it very much. Just one final comment. I was reading this morning a profile of Adlai Stevenson's life, and he once gave a speech, and I'll paraphrase what he said about a legend from the Talmud that said, in any period of history, the heavens themselves are held in place by virtue, love, and the shining integrity of 12 just men and women. That's what this enterprise is about, people getting together to talk to each other so that we can hold a very important and vital enterprise, the free flow of information, together. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for participating. Thank you at home.